students only, okay? The public part of that doesn't start until an evening with General Grant at 7 o'clock. So Friday, we're having 278 graders from all around the county that are going to be bussed in and have this wonderful hands-on experience and learn about the Civil War. And Nancy is going to be talking to them about Alabama Jim Sutton. Thank you. Yes?
Can I get tickets to the Friday night?
There are no tickets for Friday night. Friday night, just come Friday night.
Pay at the door.
Pay at the door. And we hope to see everybody there because it's going to be such a wonderful program. Thank you, my dear.
Oh.
Hang on.
You don't have to hang on. All right, so this is the story of Private James H. Sutton, who fought on both sides of the Civil War. He was my great-great-grandfather on my father's side. And he was born in 1843 and died in 1938. And up here they called him Alabama Jim. Is this loud enough?
Not on.
It's not. It was on.
It's on.
Okay.
Got to get really close. Okay. All right. So just some simple little facts about the Civil War. It was the bloodiest war in American history, as you probably already know. They had 642,427 total Union casualties and about 423,000 Confederate casualties, for a total of over 1 million, 1.25 million, well, 1.1 of people who died in that war. And they may have been killed in battle, they may have had disease, they may have been wounded in action, or prisoners of war. So they weren't all dead, but they were injured. So the mortality rate for the Union was 15.5% and the Confederates 12%. So already there was a good chance that your son or daughter might not survive. So that's why I say he survived the Civil War. He was the last Civil War veteran in Jackson County. He died at the age of 95 in 1938. So my sister, Julie Jacoby, wrote the story of Alabama Jim in high school. And she interviewed my grandmother, Alice Wilcox Cornelius, and her sister, Aunt Ruth Wilcox Woods. And they were granddaughters, and they had lots of stories to share. But one treasure that we found was Harriet Blake had interviewed Grandpa Sutton in his later years. I think he was about 85 years old. And it had to be around 1930, somewhere in there. And this is where some of the stories and all of the quotes came from. And so this was a very exciting thing to find. It was, the Suttons had it, but our branch did not. Well, Virginia Puelka had it, she donated it to the museum, so I thank her for that. So these are the women who kept the story of Alabama Jim alive in our family. Since we started, I've found more relatives and descendants that I didn't know, and they have stories too, so here we go. So he was orphaned at age 9. He was born in Huntsville, Alabama, March 7th, 1843, and his parents were David Benjamin and Sarah Sulzer Sutton. His father died in 1849 at age 29, and his mother in 1853 at age 37. So I think he was probably in some sort of an orphanage or something until he was 13, when he was bound out to work at the James Canamore family. This family was Pennsylvania Dutch, and up here in northeast Alabama was a pocket of Northern sympathizers. So they opposed secession, they believed in the Union of the United States, and they favored Abraham Lincoln. So he grew up in this area of Union sympathizers. He was pretty vocal about it, from what I understand, and he wasn't much liked by the people who favored Southern succession. So one version says he was actually taken by force and impressed into the rebel army. So he was between two evils. He believed in the Union, he was fighting for the South, and he had to make sure that he didn't inadvertently say something that would make the rebel army angry. So that's an interesting place to be. So he was 17 when he was conscripted into the 48th Cavalry, Company E, in the infantry. And he was a corporal, and corporals do all the work, the grunt work. And the quote that he had, "If I had known then what I know now, I would have fought a little harder to resist being taken into the army." So he was never issued a gray uniform, and he saw lots of infantry action in Virginia. He served under Warren Ross. And he said, "While I was in the rebel army, I took the clothes off dead men and went on." But his overall thing was, I was always a Union man though. I believed in the whole United States and was always one to advocate Abe Lincoln's policies. So in June of 1862, which would have only been about 3 months after he was impressed or was drafted, he went to the Eastern Theater, and he fought in several battles in Virginia for the Confederacy. So at the end of June in 1862, he was in the 7 Days Battle, which was Chickahominy. That was a swamp. August 9th was the Battle of Cedar Run. It was also called the Slaughter's Mountain. August 28th through 30, it was the Second Battle of Manassas, which they refer to as the Second Battle of Bull Run. September 15th, 1862, was the Siege of Harper's Ferry. September 17th, he was at the Battle of Sharpsburg, which was Antietam. And many of these are familiar names. So, at that point, in November or December of 1862, he was actually listed on the hospital muster roll, which means he was in the hospital. So here, we do have his military records, and I just pulled some of the ones that are relevant. Here you can see the hospital muster roll, November and December. It wasn't really dated, but he was in Guntersville with Captain Ragman, and his period of enlistment was 3 years. So down here it just says not stated in the period or anything. So we know he was injured at that point. And later stories, maybe it was gunpowder. I've got another little thing to think about there. So December 13th, he was back to the Battle of Fredericksburg. So keep in mind that this was on the East Coast, or in the East, in Virginia. And this is referred to later in his stories of desertion. Okay, then he was in the Suffolk campaign in 1863. But then in July 1st, he was absent and he was sick. So he missed the Battle of Gettysburg, although his infantry was in it. Then he was furloughed home until August into Claysville, Alabama. And this again is the hospital muster roll. Oh, I guess that's the same one. And then, at the end of July, he was paid for 23 days of furlough. So he was paid at the end of July. Now, I really like this quote. I saw plenty of fight in Virginia. So here's some stories he had. While I was in Old Manassas Valley, I came near dying of thirst. There were a lot of pines there, and the streams were empty. I was terribly dry. I had a canteen with me, but some of the boys didn't have any. While we were marching through this pine desert, I couldn't very well take out my canteen while the other fellows were gasping for water. So he suffered right along with them. We lived on bacon and hardtack, which consisted of pea crackers while I was in the rebel army, and baked bread. His granddaughter added that she had heard him tell they made bread out of flour and salt and baked it on a ramrod stick from loading their guns. The standard Union rations were bread, coffee, and salt pork. While I was in the infantry, the fellows I was with got their legs broken and many were wounded. Lots of my company were killed. I remember one poor fellow who got shot and he asked me to carry him. I couldn't carry you, I told him. Then I commanded him to lie down. Just as I said those words, another bullet struck him in the chest and he died without uttering another sound. Lucky to survive. As far as that goes, the whole war was terrible. The lead would go over our head like bees, volley after volley. There were many men killed in the battle that weren't even buried. I got so I didn't care for dead men. While I was sleeping in the hills once, I found myself lying beside a dead man. I got so I didn't mind. There were several batters near the Hampton Roads, which is located from Chesapeake Bay to Washington and consists of a channel 4 miles wide. The fighting here was done by gunboats, the Monitor and the Virginia. I was at the place where the Monitor, which was the northern vessel, went down at Hampton Roads. So these were Confederate victories here in the East. At the second Battle of Bull Run, I was in the Battle of Bull Run. We filled in ditches there, shovels and filling in ditches. Do you know why it was called Bull Run? He explained, on this mountain we fought on ran a small stream about 1 foot wide, and the banks were 15 feet tall. The stream was called Bull Run. At Manassas, which is the city by Bull Run, was where I was in command of a small division. The oak trees were only 1 foot high, but they were loaded with acorns. I always claimed that it would be a great place for a blind sow. But I saw the greatest destruction of any battle at Bull Run. There was a bridge over the small stream surrounded by banks 15 feet deep. When the soldiers retreated from Manassas and went to Bull Run, the bridge broke down because of the heavy stampede. Many soldiers were trampled to death in the ditch. Many of the infantry were killed in this stampede. The cavalry that was still in the Confederate Army I saw kept falling into the ditch onto the poor soldiers. At the Battle of Gaines' Mill, which was the Battle of Chickahominy River, and it was really a swamp, and it was in the 7 days battle. I remember while I was a horrible battle at Chickahominy Swamp, which was an area 2 miles filled with water. In this battle, which took place east of Richmond, the water was from knee-deep to hip-deep. We fought and fell in the quicksand while a detail propped up the wounded against stumps or trees to prevent their drowning. So here he had another injury. And this is for 1863, and he was absent, at home, blind. This says at home blind as the official report. So that was February through April. While on furlough, he was paid 40 cents a day, 40 days at 25 cents a day. And who signed it? And it and change. So he made $10 while on furlough. But here you have the signatures and everything on this. We're lucky to have Confederate records because a lot of them were destroyed in the aftermath of the war. So you've got him on furlough until August of 1863. So Alabama Jim dodged a bullet, almost literally. They were transferred to the Western Theater in September of 1863. So they were back home. They were in Western Alabama as opposed to Eastern Alabama. So with the 48th Cavalry, this infantry had 1,100 men, and 150 were killed in action, and 165 to disease. That's 29% of their men died, and that doesn't include the injured. So he had a 1 in 3 chance of not making it through that infantry as the war went on. So the question is, would Alabama Jim have survived had he stayed in the rebel army? Of course, we'll never know. But it was here, okay, he served in the Muscle Shoals, and the Muscle Shoals are where the star is, and it's a bunch of shallow water with lots of rocks in it. Okay, so he was in that area, and in western Tennessee there, central Tennessee, mostly south of Nashville. So it was here he was able to escape with the rebels with some fellow soldiers. We have found no records from the Confederacy listing him as a deserter. So came the opportunity to desert. Now, think about this as we go through the stories. After 6 months, he was able to escape the rebels with some fellow soldiers. He spent 6 to 9 months in the Muscle Shoals while in the rebel army. That was after they came back, and they skipped out and stayed quite a while before enlisting again. So, as you go through this, we don't know whether he actually deserted in the Eastern Theater or the Western Theater, but I'm guessing that they deserted somewhere along in between there somewhere. So if he escaped in the East in July or in 1863, did they even know he was gone? Was he out for 6 to 9 months if he enlisted in December of 1863? 9 months would have been March of 1863 when he was on furlough, I believe, if I go back right. He was at the Battle of Gettysburg, according to records, in July of 1863. But then again, his injuries say maybe he wasn't, and he was furloughed until August of 1863. So if he was, it's just confusing of where he is. But there's 2 stories regardless of what he said. So this is a newspaper article that came. Then came winter quarters near Fredericksburg. Now remember, that was in Virginia. And Alabama and 9 companions who were stationed in a rough shack some distance from the main barracks decided they'd go home for the winter. With supplies for a couple of days, they took leave of their quarters one night and ended up in the Blue Ridge, and they spent the night. They crept by night and hidden, slept by day until they neared their journey's end. Near Raccoon and Lookout Mountains, the group separated going into Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Now the Raccoon and Lookout Mountains were actually in Tennessee. Hot cakes from the Negroes had fed them, and once one of their group was captured, only to buy his freedom with $5 of Confederate money. At home, he bushwhacked. I didn't bushwhack the Union soldiers, but the bushwhackers themselves, he explained, adding that this is how many of the Southerners took this methods of foraging for their own stuff. In order to get into the Union Army, he sneaked onto the lines of the 4th Ohio Cavalry, and then near Woodville, Ohio, in his home county, Woodville, Alabama, in his home county, he gave himself up as a rebel soldier. He was arrested and sent to the guardhouse as a prisoner. Finally, he and some companions were given permission to go to Nashville, where they enlisted in the Federal Cavalry outfit in which Alabama served throughout the rest of the war. Escape story number 2 comes more from the family. Okay. At Fredericksburg, Virginia, there were 10 men under him. He asked, "How many of you will go with me and get out of serving the South?" All went with him, and 1 soldier was sent to a Union camp to sneak away with their outfits. The last time these deserters were together was at Lookout Mountain and Mount Raccoon in Tennessee. They never met again. These mountains were actually part of the Battle of Chickamauga in Tennessee. He hid in the woods for some time. He found himself mixed up with a band of bushwhackers. Those are Civil War guerrilla men who hid in bushes to jump on people and soldiers when they weren't expecting it. He was forced to be a bushwhacker to avoid being sent back to the Confederacy. He also put on a dress and sunbonnet and pretend to be a woman plowing the fields, just like the women whose husbands were in the army. Women did the farm work while the husbands were at war. Sometimes he had sympathetic aid from the Canamore family. They would bring him food in the woods. But more often, he depended upon himself. Then the Union captured the railroad in the area. So in the fall of 1863, at age 19, he surrendered to the commander of the 4th Ohio Cavalry. He was put in the guardhouse and was given parole on the condition he would enlist in the Union Army. And on December 12th, he enlisted in Company E of the 12th Tennessee Cavalry at Nashville, Tennessee. And this is the unit he was in until the close of the war. So while he was in the cavalry, when I enlisted in the Union, I was in the 12th Tennessee Cavalry. I don't remember whether my horse had a name or not, but if he did, he was probably called Old Trusty. He certainly was a beauty, gray with black spots. I saw most of my service in Middle Tennessee, south of Nashville. As a mounted man, I located the enemy and reported my findings to my general. Sometimes I would ride all day, and sometimes I would ride all night. On March 1st, 1864, he was promoted to the 2nd Chief Bugler. And he was part of the company band, and that was a promotion, meaning he got paid more. But they also had to learn a lot of, I think there were about 30 bugle calls. Let's see if I can get this to go. I could do it at school. Maybe it's not going to load. Anyway, it was just examples of bugle calls, and many of them I'm sure that you are familiar with. I'm going to have to start over here, sorry. Lost my mouse. You might turn that off for a second. This I did not see happening, so let's try and go back to it again. Here we go. There we go. Okay. Good, it's right back. Okay. There, we're back. Got it, okay. Okay, we get back. I am so sorry.
We're not mad, Nancy.
I'm
None of us are
glad I'm
mad.
not the only one.
Where were we? We were just where he deserted, weren't we? He had been promoted to bugler.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Okay, well, once we were hunting guerrillas, or bushwhacker men who laid by the side of the road and whacked soldiers. They got away. While we were hunting for them, we came to a place and asked an old Negro if he had seen these men. They just went down that house yonder, he replied, so we charged and caught them. Creasy, my general, sometimes called the Arkansas Jayhawker, that's a northern guerrilla like the bushwhackers, took a pistol and shot them. Then he paid a Negro 50 cents to lay them out. We trailed those fellows day and night. We were forced to hang that old Negro by the neck till he was just about gone for 3 times before he would tell where, and he drifted off. So this is Civil War era stuff. And once he got mixed up with some spies. One day we're chasing 2 spies who were riding double on horseback. One spy jumped off. Bill Betledge, my chum, who was a blacksmith for our company, caught a spy, a Mr. Green. It was the duty of my chum to fix the shoes of horses, even in regular battle. On our way to camp with our prisoner, Mr. Green's sister saw us and sure gave us a scorching, but we just laughed at her as we passed her home, taking their spy to camp. So Jim's last battle was at the Franklin-Nashville campaign under Lieutenant General Bell Hood. Now that was Confederate, the Confederate Army. That was their campaign. It was also called Hood's Tennessee Campaign. It was a series of battles from September 18th to December 27th, 1864. So that was a long time. It was a decisive Union victory, and it destroyed the Confederate Army of Tennessee. In my last battle, Hood, who was a Confederate, made his desperate rush on Nashville. He crossed the Tennessee River through the Muscle Shoals, that rocky area that was shallow, and came up Middle Tennessee. We were prepared for him, Hood, so the battle didn't last long. We completely shattered his force at Nashville. And this was getting closer to the end, 1864. His injuries in the war, he said he didn't have any injuries but one accident. I'm wondering if that was the accident that sent him to the injury back in the beginning. My cavalry hat was broken by a shot when my head was ducked. Captain Creasy had warned, "Dodge them, son, if you can," meaning the bullets, dodging bullets. So the family stories are he had a crippled forefinger thought to have been injured from a shell, and that could have been that very first one. One eye was injured with a powder blast. He does have one smaller eye in his head, and he was issued a pension for the blind. And as we go through the rest of it, we'll see. Alabama Jim was often teased about receiving a blind pension, since he supposedly could see whether or not a lady walking on the other side of the street had a petticoat on. So his illness at the end of the war, he got sick with ill, and he was taken to the hospital on November 20th, 1864. It was number 8 in Nashville, Tennessee. He listed his next of kin as Sister Mary, and that would be Mary Jones in Alabama. He was diagnosed with conjunctivitis, and that would have been pink eye. And his quote on that was, "One other time I was sick and had to go to the Zollicoffer. A man by that name had built it, a hospital in Nashville. While I was there, my brother Andy said, 'Jim, if this money was worth anything, I'd be the richest man in the world,'" meaning Confederate money. And there you can see his diagnosis of conjunctivitis. Right here. And number 8, General Hospital in Nashville, right here, stamped. So he ended up mustering out on August 1st in 1865. He freely admitted that he had cause to be afraid to return to the South, and he felt everything was fair in love and war, but some people still did not feel very kindly toward a deserter. It would be 43 years after the war before he went back to his old home and found only 4 of his friends living. He felt everything was fair in love and war, but some people did not feel that way at all. So at the end of the war, in the closing battle of Richmond, the rebels were surrounded when they surrendered. Both armies were lined up in an area of ground in the valley. Lee and Grant had quite a time before the surrender. Lee claimed to Grant, "I can cut my way out." Grant replied, "You have not many men." Lee answered, "I believe I have a great good many men." Grant advised, "I've got you hemmed in, so now the best thing you can do to save thousands of lives is surrender now." So Lee surrendered at Appomattox on Richmond in April of 1865. So after he was in Nashville at that hospital, he was transferred. This particular military record says that on November 20, 1864, he was admitted, well, he was traveled on that day, and he was admitted to Jefferson General Hospital in Jefferson, Indiana. He listed his next of kin as John Sutton, his brother, and he was diagnosed with cataracts of both eyes. They transferred me to Indiana from Nashville, but the sick were coming in so fast that they transferred me from hospital to hospital until they finally discharged me from Madison, Indiana. I was discharged 4 days before Eli Moody, but I got permission from the head nurse to wait for him so we could come back north together. This is his individual muster-out roll. The note on the back says transportation furnished while on furlough, and they charged him $5. This includes the final accounting of payroll, which would be his bounty paid. He was paid 25 cents, and he was due $75 for all that time that was left. He wasn't charged anything for equipment. I am assuming that equipment that he would have bought might have been his gun, but if he was in the hospital, maybe he didn't have his gun anymore. This copy was issued in 1891. That is when he applied for his blind pension. They have military records, and then they have pension files. So the company muster-out roll was very similar, but there was no accounting on it. And I had been talking with a cousin, it must be a couple months ago already. It was Joe Puelka, and he's like 6'7", like he's really tall. And I said to him, "How tall do you think Alabama Jim was?" And he says, "Well, I think he was short, wasn't he? He was like 5'2" or 5'4", and I said, "Well, I always got the impression that he was tall." You know, of course, my grandmother was 5'2", and Joe was 6'7", so we really didn't know. But by golly, we found the company descriptive book. And thanks to the Union Army, we know that he was 5 foot 8.5 inches tall, which I would guess was average. I mean, there were a lot of tall people in the Civil War as well. He was light complected, light haired, and gray eyes. So, Memories from Grandpa Sutton. I and Eli Moody, after a discharge at Madison, Indiana, came north. I left a sister and 2 brothers in the South. I have been back only twice after the war. The last time was 23 years ago, but all my brothers are dead now. I've been reminiscing a lot more lately, and it seems to me now that I always got away from relation. I bummed around with the Bradley boys after the war. Moody was from Esgate, so I worked out well there. A year after the war, I married a girl at Esgate, Anne Flynn. So here's a family picture, and his children were Sarah Sutton Clark, Alabama Jim. Let's see, this would be Glenn, and he was called Dick, and he married Myrtle. Can't think of what. And here was Sydney Ann Sutton, I think they just called her Ann, and Elma Waters, Elma Sutton Waters, and her relatives live in this area, Tom Waters and Linda upstairs. Over here we have Mary Sutton Lafayette. She married William Lafayette, and I think they lived in Minnesota. And then we have Charles, who married Chloe Clark, Martin Haddon Sutton, and he went by Haddon. He married Mary Eliza Anderson. Wiley married Mary McCrum. And I think they lived in Nebraska, but there are some of his descendants in Wyoming. I haven't found them yet, I haven't had time. And then my great-grandmother, Lily Ann Sutton Wilcox. Here was their barn. Many of you have probably seen this picture. And the people pictured in this, I'll name in the next slide. But they lived on a 50-acre farm that was given to them by her father, Martin Flynn. And it is actually listed in the 1890 plat book as S.A. Sutton, but it should be A.S. Sutton, and it should be S.A. for Sydney Ann. So women did have property in their names back in the day. He was a farmer and a stagecoach driver. He drove a team of mules and carried mail and passengers between Maquoketa and Fulton. Here's their house, raising 10 children. And as near as I can tell just by comparing, this is Sarah Clark, the daughter, Sarah Sutton Clark. This person, I believe, is William Lafayette, which would be Mary Sutton Lafayette's husband. And she has a hat on. This is Alabama Jim, Sydney Ann Sutton, and this is Glenn and Martin Haddon. He's very tall. Okay, so what I think is that these two were back from Minnesota visiting and they took a picture. I'm just guessing, I'm just dreaming there. One thing that came down from just a few stories is that he valued education. So he was fortunate to be able to read. And he read the newspaper religiously, cover to cover, and studied history so he could educate himself. He had his own ideas on issues and enjoyed talking politics with other citizens. So these habits were very, they were pretty common in our house. My grandmother she read the paper cover to cover every day, even when she was 95. And she loved to talk politics, and so did Aunt Ruth. And they'd argue because one was a staunch Democrat and one was a staunch Republican, but anyway. And Virginia Puelka, I remember talking with her, and she once said that we owed our pursuit of education to our great-grandmother, Lily Sutton Wilcox, because she was the one who encouraged her children to go to school. One story says that Grandma Alice was going to go to school in high school, but her father wouldn't give consent for her to go to high school in Maquoketa until the very last day. And off she went, and she graduated in the class of 1923 from Maquoketa High School. She also stood up to her in-laws to send her sons to college. So, yeah. So maybe this actually came down from Alabama Jim. So he joined the Grand Army of the Republic, which is basically the Veterans Association for Civil War. It was the first veterans group to lobby for benefits for Civil War veterans. It was founded in April 1862 and disbanded February 19th, 1930. There just weren't very many Civil War veterans left. And Alabama Jim joined July 3rd, 1923. The ladies of the GAR were the support group for that. They supported the war and the soldiers by raising money and volunteering, doing bandages and all those kinds of things. And they are still alive today if you have Civil War relatives and want another organization to belong to. They would have union encampments. And this and the medal I found in my grandmother's house after everybody had taken all their stuff and I was in charge of making everything go away. The medal in this one was actually in the bottom of a goblet, a stem. It wasn't a goblet, it was a candy, were they candy dishes? It was green. And it had a lot of snips of paper in it, like receipts and sizes of people for Christmas present clothes and those kinds of little things. And I was going through it and getting it all figured out. And at the bottom was this medal, which you really couldn't see. So I felt like she got it out because we had been talking about encampments shortly before she died. And I found it, so I was really tickled that I did end up with it. And she had a registration, and on this side is the list of veterans attending the encampment in Maquoketa September 20th, 21st, 25th, and 26th, 24th, 25th, and 26th, 1901. And here highlighted is Alabama Jim's name. So I found this in my grandmother's house, just with all of her books. She just had it and she just treasured it. So this is a postcard from an encampment, and you can see that they are lined up. And on the back it says, this is the whole regiment lined up in dress parade and in full dress uniform. It's a fine sight. There are about 600 of them. And they had well over 100 reunions, encampments. And I suppose it would be considered a reenactment that we have today. And it's a handwritten on the back. So the GAR, he used to love to tell stories down there, and they had the whittling club down at a livery stable. They drank coffee and swapped stories. Apparently that is a very old custom. Now it's called the Cavemen Citizens Against virtually everything. What men get together and have coffee and, you know. So as a member of the A.W. Drips Post of the Grand Army of the Republic, Mr. Sutton used to enjoy himself at post meetings by reminding the others how we sure beat you Yanks at Bull Run. And then, just as the other veterans were about to become angry with him, he changed his position and began talking about the glorious northern victories in which he had fought with other post members. I guess we made those Rebs run all right, he would exclaim. So he was asked, did you ever see Abe Lincoln? Sure, I saw Abe Lincoln. Then, with a deep laugh, I do believe he was the homeliest man I ever saw. He used to go through the camps advising the soldiers, boys, you must do this, and boys, you must do that. So what did you think of General Grant? I think Stonewall Jackson was a better general than Grant. Grant has more wind. He had the bigger army, and he would send smaller ones out to do the actual fighting. He was drunk most of the time, I guess. Quite a whiskey man. And these are just some pictures showing Alabama Jim. And some of you do remember my father. And every time I look at a picture of Aunt Iva, this is Mamie Clark, Grandpa Sutton, Eva Wilcox, which would have been my grandmother's sister. And the back was Iva Wilcox, May Clark, and Opal Wilcox. And these were all cousins. And that's my dad's high school graduation picture. And for you guys, I just couldn't resist sticking it in there. Because I see a definite family resemblance. He does look a little bit like my grandmother, but more like her sister. We all see that, right? Okay, so, and this one over here is 4 generations. Pauline Beaver, Eva, Grandma Lily, and Grandpa Sutton. Here he is in a family picture. And again, I haven't looked close enough, but these are definitely his children that were in the area in Macokota and Fulton. The other ones were living further away. Whether they were still living, I'm not sure. I don't have a date on this picture. But this is, let's see, Glenn Sutton, which was Uncle Dick. Martin Haddon Sutton. I believe this is Lily Sutton Wilcox, Alabama Jim, Elma Sutton Waters, and Charles Sutton. So this was probably he died in 1938, so probably not too long before that, because he looks like he's getting frailer. So he died on October 6th of 1938. He contracted influenza and died 11 days later at the home of my great-grandmother, Lily Sutton Wilcox. That's on East Apple Street. His wife, Sidney Ann Flynn, had preceded him in death on January 3rd, 1920, at age 76. He was the oldest Civil War veteran living in Jackson County. Just some memories. Aunt Ruth said one of the pleasures of my childhood was my trips to Alabama Jim's place, where the honey was just great. Grandpa kept bees, and he always had 3 cakes in the dish, and that was good. Did anybody have honeycomb on their tables? We did all the time, yeah. Yeah, we had it a lot. Beautiful tattoos were also acquired during the war. An American flag and an eagle were printed on one of his arms. The tattoos were of great interest. Oops. Get the... Okay. Yeah, I've done this a lot. Oh, now we got that in here. That didn't come like I thought it should. Anyway. My grandmother, grandchild of James H. Sutton, remembers asking Grandpa to roll up his sleeve just so she could admire his tattoos. When a grandson asked if he was ever scared, he said, "Son, I was so scared I ran so far in 3 hours it took me 3 weeks to walk back." He liked fox hunting and went as far as Seldom Seen, 3 miles east of Andrew. It's a pleasant coincidence that it was later owned by granddaughter Alice Wilcox Cornelius and her husband Gilbert, my grandparents. It's still in the Cornelius family. Let's see. And he's buried at Esgid. Let's see what the problem is. There we go. Oh. Okay, so he died October 6, 1938 at age 95, and he is buried at Esgid. There is a family plot there where many of his children and his parents and his in-laws are buried as well. The Sutton Cemetery has quite a few of his other children. And he is designated a Civil War veteran. So, thank you for serving, Grandpa Sutton.